Broca from the east. At this confluence of waters, known as a comer in Ireland, a Norman castle was built, with the rivers forming a protective moat, hence the name Castlecomer. The Wanesford family originated in Kirkington near Richmond in Yorkshire, and in 1633, Sir Christopher Wanesford was appointed as Master of the Rolls and the Lord Chief Justice in Ireland. The County Kilkenny estate of 20, there's various figures given from 22 to 24, so I've said 23. The estate of 23,000 acres included the mineral rights, and it was acquired by him in 1635 in the face of opposition from the Brennans, the original inhabitants of the area. And I was a Brennan before I was a Downey. 5 generations later, his descendant, Lady Anne Wanesford, she became the Countess of Ormond on her marriage to John Butler, the Duke of Ormond, at 15 years of age, bringing to the union a very large welcome fortune. As I gathered, their fortunes weren't very healthy at that stage. On her death in 1830, the inheritor of the Castlecomer estate was her 4th son, the Honourable Charles Howard Butler Clark Southwell Wanesford. Each of those names were attached to inheritances, Clark and Southwell and Wanesford, but he was known as Butler Clark for a long time. And I must mention the late Edward Law, who came across some references to Charles Butler Clark in the library in Northumberland. And he very kindly passed on the information to me, and I got a lot of information there. I had a great time with my sources. Anyway, that was one of them. He lived from 1780 until 1860, and on assuming control, he set about maximising the revenues from the estate and the collieries by ending the prevailing middleman leasing system and restoring direct control to the landlord. His immediate successors had shorter periods in charge of the estate until 1892, when his great-grandson, Richard Henry Prior Wanesford, acceded to the estate. Since the death of the Honourable Charles, the collieries had been leased mainly to the Dobbs family, and the affairs of the estate were conducted by agents. He ushered in a new era of, this is Richard Henry, a new era of energetic involvement in the running of the estate and the collieries. Under his tenure, the bulk of the estate was sold to the tenants under the terms of the Land Act of 1903. I think that was the Wyndham Act, with a sizable portion of the domain, woodlands, parklands, and the home farm retained for his own use, approximately 1,500 acres. He invested a considerable amount of the proceeds of the land sale in the development of the collieries, which provided direct employment to 600 to 800 people, and at times there was 1,000 people in the Castlecomer area, and he sustained the local economy. In 1917, he set up the Castlecomer Collieries Limited. This company managed the collieries until they were closed in 1969. Now, coal seams are formed from layers and layers of fossilized vegetation laid down over a period of millions of years through the decay of primordial swamps, and mostly during the Carboniferous period, which was circa 350 million years ago. As age followed age, the vegetation of the swamps was covered up and compressed by millions of tons of mud and sand, which formed the shales and sandstones. In the case of anthracite, the pressure was so great that practically all the gases were pressed out. The remains of those early plants and animals make up the bulk of our coal. Fossils found in the Castlecomer coal excited the interest of geologists and scholars and the expertise of scientists like Professor E.P. Wright of Trinity College and Thomas Huxley, a friend of Charles Darwin. And if you're interested in looking at fossils, you can visit the Discovery Park in Castlecomer, who have lovely examples of them. The Castlecomer coal is anthracite because of its high, because of its high carbon content, is smokeless. It is cleaner than bituminous coal, as no soot is deposited, and chimney sweeping is unnecessary. Compact and lustrous, it emits an intense heat, making a clean, bright, steady fire, which requires little attention. Once ignited, an anthracite fire can be kept burning indefinitely with stoking from above, and the intensity of the fire can be controlled by changing the draft. Less ash is made, and the cinders can be reburned. An important safety consideration is that there is no methane gas in anthracite mines, such as causes fatal explosions in bituminous coal pits. It was possible to use naked lights, such as candles and carbide lamps, common before electric light became available. The Castlecomer mines were spared the multiple deaths caused by gas explosions in other mines. Most of the fatalities in Castlecomer were caused by falls of rock. And there you're looking at a tunnel being propped up, yeah. Now, the first written reference that I found to Castlecomer coal was by Gerard Boat, who in his description of Ireland in 1645 and why it might be further improved by consolidation of the English Protestant interest, he wrote, "The coals are very heavy and burn with little flame, but lie like charcoal and continue to the space of 7 or 8 hours, casting a very great and violent heat." Later in his 1652 publication, he wrote, "Already one coal mine had been found out in Ireland a few years since by mere hazard and without having been sought for. The iron mine is in the province of Leinster, and for a great while they had drawn iron ore out of it, and by degrees they had gone deeper. The coals were found sufficient to furnish a whole country." The Castlecomer coalfield continued to be the subject of exploratory surveys as the proprietors sought to maximise the profits from the collieries. These surveys were carried out by experienced geologists and engineers and surveyors, and were revised as further information became available through mining operations and explorations. The main productive seams in Castlecomer colliery were the old 3-foot, which was the earliest to be worked out, the Jarrow and the Skahana. The first of these seams lay between 5 and 100 feet from the surface, was easily worked, produced excellent quality coal, free burning with very low sulphur content, and was probably the seam referred to by Gerald Boat in the mid-17th century. The Jarrow was so called because of the miners from Durham in the north of England who were brought in to work the seam in the late 18th century, and they thought it resembled the quality of the Jarrow coal. Here the coal was found at depths of 50 to 80 yards and maintained a thickness of 9 to 12 inches over its restricted extent, with parts reaching a thickness of 4 feet. Following explorations made by the Castlecomer Mining Company in 1915, Another seam was opened at Skahana, which was regarded as the most important bed of coal in the entire area, with an average thickness of 24 inches and yielding high quality anthracite coal. In 1924, an inclined shaft or drift was sunk to this seam at Deer Park, the two shafts being connected by underground workings. The Deer Park Colliery was the latest and the most productive mine and was worked for 45 years until 1969. A government inquiry into the position of the coal industry in Ireland in 1919 reported that the reserves of coal in the Leinster coalfield were approximately 153 million tonnes, almost 85% of the total reserves for the whole country. The annual output of coal in Ireland in 1918 was 92,000 tonnes, and 69% of that was produced by Castlecomer collieries, making Castlecomer the most productive coalfield in the country. Anthracite was used for many purposes, from ordinary house fires to greenhouses, malting, locomotives, and Atlantic liners. Interest was expressed in using it for purposes other than heating because of its high carbon content. Graphite could be made from coal high in carbon and was used for high-grade pencils, as foundry facings, for lubricating work, in stove polish and graphite paints, and in various lines of electrical work, such as the manufacture of dry batteries and motor brushes. But the heavy freight charges of £5 per tonne militated against such diversification. In the early days, the usual custom was for the proprietor to sink the pit, then farm it out to a master collier who undertook to obtain a crew to work the coal for a share of the profits. Others signed contracts giving them permission to open pits on lands leased from the estate. Management of the collieries was left in the hands of the estate agents and the expert mining engineers who were employed by the proprietors to advise on and superintend the running of the collieries, reporting directly to the proprietors. An especially detailed picture of the workings of the Castlecomer collieries in the early 19th century is provided by reports submitted to the Honourable Charge by the English mining engineer Matthias Dunn. The situation had deteriorated greatly from the second half of the 18th century, when the collieries yielded a profit as much as 10,000 a year in 1778 to as little as 2,000 in 1799. And in the early years of the 19th century, expenditure was almost equal to earnings. The amount of 10,000 in 1778 was the equivalent, when I was doing this research, it was the equivalent of approximately 2.5 million, and it was around that time, I meant to check the date, that Lady Anne married the Duke of Ormond, so she had a fine fortune. Dunn was requested to inspect the collieries to see what changes he could recommend that would increase productivity and profits. That's what it was all about. The available workforce was enumerated. 1,000 colliers or hewers, you have to be careful how you say that word, at 2 shillings per day, 200 hurriers at 2 shillings, 300 thrusters at 1 8p, 300 pullers and 70 scavengers at 1 6p. A horse and a driver was 5 shillings a day. To this total was added the proprietor's staff, which consisted of 18 agents and clerks, 2 weighmen, 80 rangers and watchmen, and 50 men employed as roads and labourers, making a grand total of 1,985 men. This was in the early 19th century. Tom Ling, in his book, Castlecomer Connections, he describes rangers as security men who kept up a foot patrol, and watchmen were for more immediate security. The cost of watchmen and police who were hired to guard the deposits of coal on the surface amount to 1,500 per annum, and candles costing 5 shillings brought the whole cost to £3 10 shillings. And this outlay would produce 12.5 tons of large coal and 11 tons of column per day. The column is the coal dust, I suppose you would call it. But Matthias Dunn didn't approve of how the men were paid. He said, the colliers' earnings are mostly by the day from 1 to 2 shillings, subject, however, to the holding back of their wages until the coals are sold. This produces great misery, which is increased by the generality of these contractors keeping shops, and who pay the colliers instead of money with goods, upon which they charge an exorbitant profit. The natural consequences of such delays in these payments is to run them into debt from which they can never emerge. Having advised on human resource management, Dunn considered it necessary for the whole old colliery being opened up if the people are to be kept alive and free of rebellion. The miners formed combinations as they objected to the terms and conditions being introduced, and they felt that these modern methods would deprive them of jobs. Dunn was critical of the apparent lack of interest in his estate by the Honourable Charles, and such criticism and his apparent concern for the workers may well have soured relations, and by May 1833, the arrangement did not seem to be working out, and Dunn renounced all claim or demand on Wansford, who agreed to pay him £1,600 to renounce the contract. During the 17th and 18th centuries, similar methods of extracting coal were used in most coalfields in the British Isles. In Castlecomer, there were outcrops of coal within a few feet of the surface in the 3-foot seam. The working of these outcrops was limited to what could be procured by open cast mining and basket work. When this coal was worked out, it was necessary to go deeper. Shafts were sunk to depths of 6 to 20 feet until the seam was reached. At the base of the shaft, the coal was mined as far as the miners dared, making a bell-shaped cavity, and this was known as bell mining. I think we have a slide of that. Yes, that's it. Later, a second shaft would be dug at a distance of about 50 yards, and an underground tunnel would link the shafts to allow for free circulation of air. All the coals could not be taken out as the roof would have collapsed, so pillars of coal were left as supports for the roof, but the miners were able to remove 85% of the coal. In the 19th century, a master collier would organise a team of about 50 men to, as they say, win the coal. These masters were generally the farmers or leaseholders of the farm out of which the coal was taken. The team was made up of clearers, cutters, breakers, and hurriers and thrusters. Clearers made access to the coal seam available, digging the shafts, making roads underground, propping the roofs. The cutters or hewers dug out the coal with wedges and hammers, and then loaded it on sleighs for transportation to the surface. The hurriers and thrusters were hauliers, who pulled the sleigh by a drawbar. the sleigh carrying 3.5 hundredweight of coal. The hurriers were held by thrusters who pushed from behind. The men walked on their hands and knees, their bodies stretched out, drawing the sleighs. The hurriers had a type of girdle which they buckled in around their loins, with a long chain going down between their legs and fastened to the sleigh. Local folklore tells us that the miners' pride in their strength and stamina led them to wear the so-called gorrel and swivel, polished for the occasion on Sundays. The sleigh was thus drawn to the bottom of the shaft from where it was winched to the surface. At first, this operation was done by a manually operated winch, later by a horse-operated gin, and in the early 20th century by a steam hauler. The sleigh was replaced by a wheel box or tram which ran on iron rails. These were made of wood up to 1925, when Deer Park trams were made of iron. Payment was made to the trammer and his helper according to the distance the tram was pushed and the tonnage. The unit was identified by a numbered token that was attached to the handle of the tram, each man on the wage list being allocated a number, which was also engraved on personal tools. These identity brass tags were issued to the men at the start of the shift and checked back at the end of the day, making sure that none were missing. Ponies were used for underground hauling at the Rock and Vera colliers in Upper Coolbawn during the first quarter of the 20th century. These ponies spent their working lives underground up to 15 years, and they were usually blind when finally retired overground. The pony train of trams was lit by a metal kettle which was used as a paraffin oil lamp, but up to the 1950s the men used pit candles, the price of which were deducted from their wages, 1 penny each or 1 6 per pound. The candles were later replaced by carbide lamps attached to the men's helmets, and these lamps were also used on the bicycles, which became the favoured mode of transport for the colliery workers. Up to between 300 and 400 bicycles would be stored in the bicycle shed. Through the effort of the local branch of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, which was established in the 1930s, a bus was provided by the company to transport some of the men to and from work. When mechanical coal cutters were introduced in the 1950s and the operators were paid a better wage, several men invested in motor cars in which they travelled to work and which were also used for social outings or for their families and friends. Even though expansion in equipment and working conditions improved over time, mining remained a hard and dangerous life. Between 1926 and 1960, 14 men were killed in accidents at the Deer Park. But apart from that, the men were prone to occupational diseases caused or aggravated by their work, such as rheumatism, rupture, eye problems, broken bones. The miner's trademark was often a blue scar on his skin where a cut healed over the coal dust. Most of the workforce inhaled dust and impure air, so that by early middle age, almost all underground workers showed symptoms of miner's lung or pneumoconiosis. It took many years before this condition was recognised in Ireland as compensatory under the workmen's compensation laws. I think it was in the 1970s, actually. Captain Wallacewood was a highly creative man and ambitious for the mining enterprise to expand. Once the railway link was made to Kilkenny, after many years of planning, he had overhead ropeways similar to ski lifts. He had them installed so that the coal could be brought to the central depot from different mine sites. He also was interested in improving conditions in the surrounding area. Houses were built, a basket and perambulator factory, which employed several women, was started, and he was involved in the early cooperative movement, among other great interests he had. Even so, he lived at some remote from the grimy reality of the daily life of his miners. And he was reminded of this by another exceptional character, Nixie Bourne. In the early 20th century, miners were probably the only proletarian community in County Kilkenny with a developed class consciousness. Among them, the early seeds of socialism germinated and flourished. Having started work in the mines as a young teenager, Nixie Bourne soon realised that the way society worked was fundamentally unjust, and the conditions under which the miners were expected to work were simply unacceptable. Pay was poor, the work was dangerous, and after working long hours underground, miners didn't even have a place to wash off the grime, but had to tramp back home in filthy clothes, which their poor wives and mothers had to wash and have ready for the morning. The captain didn't like the idea of being told how to run his great enterprise, but gradually he accepted that Bourne and the miners had a point. Although it took the best part of a decade to arrange, the long-awaited showers and lockers were set up in 1939. That's Mrs. Bournesford, and this is Nixie Bourne, and I think that's the captain, and I'm not sure who that is, one of the managers, I'd say. That was at the opening of the baths. And you see, they have a nice platform laid down so that you wouldn't dirty your shoes. Anyway, under the strong leadership of Bourne, a branch of the ITGWU was formed, and at last the miners had a dedicated union to represent them in their dealings with management. By the 1960s, the production levels of the Deer Park colliery were falling and costs were rising, and of course oil was being used more. And this inevitably resulted in the closure of the Deer Park, despite the efforts of government, management and workers. The end came on the 31st of January 1969, and thus ended 333 years of Wanesford association with Castlecomer mining. When the pumps seemed some of the men reading the notice of the closure, obviously before they went down to work. They only got a week's notice, I think. When the pumps ceased to work, it took a year to completely drown the underground passages that had been worked for 45 years. A vast amount of equipment was left underground, including rails and trams, haulage cables, coal cutters and haulers, pumps, engines, and communication apparatus. A 350 feet high heap of shale remained as a landmark on the site for many years until it was transported to Limerick for use in the cement factory. There is very little evidence today of a once dominant industry that provided wealth for the Wanesford family and a livelihood for thousands of miners and their families. On a roadside location opposite the Deer Park, a religious grotto stands as a mute monument to the devotion of several generations of coal miners. It contains a statue of Our Lady of Fatima, revered locally as patron and protector of miners, and was erected by the miners in 1952. The statue, which stands over 6 feet high, was made by Deghini and Sons in Dublin, and it cost £250, which the miners paid for. It was the custom for the miners to pause in prayer at the statue before descending into the mine for their day's work. The grotto was rededicated to the memory of Nicholas Bourne, the trade union leader, who had been vilified by clergy and the proprietors in the early 1930s and 40s, when he began the fight for justice and fairness for the coal workers of Castlecomer, and who eventually served as a member of the board of directors of the Castlecomer Collieries Limited for several years before the closure. And there's a lovely picture of it. If you don't mind, I have a little poem here, and I'm going to read it. March 1999, the Castlecomer Plateau. Wolf Hill, Holly Park, Rossmore, Deer Park, Dunan, the Vero and the Jarrow, circling the plateau, mapping the coal mines, furze, heather, weeds and grass growing through rutted roads, where men, horses, carts and trams left tracks for 400 years before the earth-moving Komatsu arrived, obliterating all. Closures, government purses, civil service mines, pits, shafts, open cast, inherited skills, another way of life. Once miners knelt to pray before trudging to the bowels of the earth, their lives depending on each other. Mary's shrine now stands on roadsides at Wolf Hill, Holly Park, Rossmore, Deer Park, Dunan, the Vero and the Jarrow. Sheena Will.
Máire, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you.
Right.